Yesterday morning, a runner stopped me with 2 words that would save my life. Hide, wait. But the danger he warned me about wasn't what I expected. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 73 years old. I live alone in a modest apartment on the north side of Chicago, where the wind cuts through you like a knife even in spring. Every morning, I walk the same route along Damen Avenue, past the coffee shop that smells like roasted beans and broken dreams, past the corner where teenagers gather with their bright laughter that reminds me of everything I've lost. Yesterday started like any other day. I pulled on my worn wool coat, the one with the loose button I keep meaning to fix, and stepped into the crisp morning air. The smell of Lake Michigan carried on the breeze, mixing with exhaust fumes and the distant aroma of fresh bread from the bakery 3 blocks over. My fingers, stiff with arthritis, gripped my small purse tighter as I navigated the cracked sidewalks that the city never seems to repair. I was thinking about my daughter Linda again. She'd promised to call me the night before, but my phone remained silent. The screen showed 3 missed calls from an unknown number, probably another telemarketer, but nothing from her. Nothing from my son Robert either. Nothing from my grandchildren. The silence had become so familiar that it felt like a companion, walking beside me step after step. As I rounded the corner onto North Avenue, my phone buzzed. Finally, I thought. But when I looked at the screen, my heart sank. It was a text from Linda, brief and cold. Can't make it today. Something came up. Maybe next week. No apology. No explanation. Just another cancellation in a long line of disappointments that had become the rhythm of my life. I stopped walking and leaned against a lamppost, feeling suddenly dizzy. The morning rush of commuters flowed around me like water around a stone. Nobody noticed an old woman struggling to catch her breath. Nobody saw the tears threatening to spill from my eyes. I was invisible. Just another piece of urban furniture in a city that never stops moving. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me. Rapid and urgent. Someone was running, getting closer. I started to move aside, assuming they needed to pass. But then a man's voice cut through the morning noise. Hide! Wait! I turned around, confused. A young man in running gear stood there, breathing heavily, sweat glistening on his dark skin despite the cool morning. His eyes were wide with something I couldn't quite identify. Concern? Fear? He looked over his shoulder, then back at me. Ma'am, you need to step back. Behind the building. Right now. Something in his voice made me obey without question. I followed him into the narrow alley between 2 buildings, my heart pounding. We pressed ourselves against the brick wall, and he held up his hand, signaling for silence. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and quick, mixing with his. Then I heard it. The screech of tires. The crash of metal against metal. The sound of glass shattering. Car horns blaring. People shouting. From our hiding spot, I couldn't see what had happened, but I could hear the chaos erupting exactly where I'd been standing just moments before. The runner looked at me, his expression grim. Drunk driver, he said quietly. I saw him coming down the street, swerving all over. He jumped the curb right where you were standing. My legs gave out. I slid down the brick wall until I was sitting on the cold pavement, my coat spread around me like a dark flower. The young man knelt beside me, his hand gently touching my shoulder. Are you okay? Should I call someone? Call someone. The question hit me like another blow. Who would he call? Linda, who couldn't be bothered to keep her promises. Robert, who treated me like an obligation. My neighbors who barely knew my name. I'm fine, I whispered, but we both knew I was lying. He helped me to my feet, and we walked carefully back to the sidewalk. The scene before us was chaos. A blue sedan had jumped the curb and crashed into the very lamppost where I'd been standing. Emergency vehicles were already arriving, their sirens wailing. The drunk driver was being pulled from his car, uninjured but belligerent. If I'd been standing there just 2 minutes longer, the runner stayed with me until the paramedics checked me over. I wasn't hurt, just shaken. But as I gave my statement to the police officer, I realized something profound had shifted inside me. Not just because I'd narrowly escaped death, but because a complete stranger had cared enough to save my life when my own family couldn't be bothered to return my calls. His name was Marcus, I learned. 28 years old, a social worker who ran this route every morning before work. He had noticed me on my walks before, he said. Always alone, always looking sad. When he saw the drunk driver careening down the street, his first thought was of the woman in the wool coat who walked the same route every day. You matter, he said simply as we waited for the police to finish their report. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Those words broke something open inside me. I started crying right there on the sidewalk, not caring who saw. Marcus didn't try to stop my tears or offer empty comfort. He just stood beside me, a steady presence in the chaos, until I was ready to go home. Walking back to my apartment, I felt like I was seeing everything with new eyes. The cracked sidewalks, the busy commuters, the familiar buildings. It all looked different somehow. I was alive. Against all odds, I was still here. But more than that, I'd been seen. I'd mattered enough for someone to risk their own safety to save mine. When I reached my building, I climbed the 4 flights of stairs to my apartment with legs that felt stronger than they had in years. I unlocked my door and stepped into the small space I'd called home for the past 15 years. But instead of the usual suffocating feeling of isolation, I felt something else. Possibility. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table, looking at the framed photographs that covered every surface. Pictures of Linda's wedding, where she'd barely spoken to me except to criticize my dress. Robert's graduation from law school, where he'd thanked everyone except the mother who'd worked 2 jobs to pay his tuition. Christmas mornings with grandchildren who played with expensive toys but couldn't remember to call their grandmother on her birthday. For years, I'd convinced myself these photos represented love, but now I saw them differently. They were evidence of a lifetime of one-sided relationships, of giving everything and receiving nothing in return. They were beautiful lies I'd told myself to avoid facing a painful truth. My children didn't love me. They needed me, used me, manipulated me. But they didn't love me. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, it felt like freedom. I picked up my phone and called Linda. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice impatient. "Mom, I told you I can't talk today. I'm busy." "I was almost killed this morning," I said quietly. There was a pause. "What do you mean?" I told her about the drunk driver, about Marcus, about how close I'd come to dying on a sidewalk where no one would have found me for hours. As I spoke, I listened for something in her voice. Concern, fear, love, anything that would tell me I mattered to my own daughter. "Well, you're fine now, right?" she said when I finished. "Look, Mom, I really do have to go. We'll talk later." The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling the last of my illusions crumble. My daughter had just learned that I'd nearly died, and her response was irritation at being interrupted. I sat there for a long time, letting the truth settle over me like snow. Then I did something I hadn't done in decades. I started thinking about what I wanted, instead of what my family needed from me. The story I'm about to tell you spans 53 years of marriage, motherhood, and a kind of slow suffocation that happens so gradually you don't notice until you can barely breathe. It's about the difference between being needed and being loved. It's about the moment when saving your own life becomes more important than keeping the peace. But first, let me tell you about the life I built for other people, brick by brick, year by year, until I disappeared completely into the foundation. I met my husband Tom in 1970, when I was 20 years old and full of dreams I couldn't even name. He was handsome and confident, a young factory worker with calloused hands and a smile that made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony at St. Alphonsus Church, with my mother crying happy tears and his mother looking skeptical. I thought I'd found my fairy tale. Instead, I'd signed up for a lifetime of service. The first sign should have been our honeymoon. We went to Wisconsin Dells, staying in a motel that smelled like cigarettes and industrial disinfectant. On our second night, Tom got food poisoning from the diner across the street. Instead of romantic dinners and long walks, I spent my honeymoon cleaning up after him and fetching medicine from the pharmacy. "You're such a good wife," he said when he finally felt better. "I'm lucky to have someone who takes care of me." I glowed at the praise, not realizing I'd just been assigned a role I'd play for the next 5 decades. When we returned to Chicago, we moved into a tiny apartment in Wicker Park, back when it was still a working-class neighborhood full of Polish immigrants and factory workers. Tom worked long hours at the steel plant, coming home exhausted and expecting dinner on the table, his clothes washed, his problems solved. I worked too, first as a secretary at an insurance company, then later taking on additional part-time jobs to help make ends meet. But Tom's exhaustion was sacred. Mine was irrelevant. "I work hard all day," he'd say when I asked for help with the housework. "Can't a man relax in his own home?" So I worked my 8-hour days, then came home to cook, clean, do laundry, pay bills, and listen to Tom's complaints about his boss, his coworkers, his back pain, his dreams deferred. My own dreams? They became as invisible as I was slowly becoming. Linda was born in 1973, a beautiful baby with dark hair and her father's stubborn chin. I loved her desperately, with a fierce protectiveness that surprised me. Finally, I thought, someone who would love me back unconditionally, someone who would need me in the best possible way. But motherhood in the 1970s, at least in my world, meant sacrifice without acknowledgement. Tom saw his role as provider, not parent. Night feedings, diaper changes, doctor visits. Those were my problems to solve. When Linda cried for hours with colic, Tom would leave the house to clear his head, returning when the crisis had passed. "You're so good with her," he'd say, as if patience with my own child was a special talent rather than basic responsibility. Robert arrived 2 years later, a placid baby who seemed to absorb the family's expectations before he could even walk. Tom was thrilled to have a son, someone to carry on the family name and fulfill all the ambitions he'd never quite achieved. I was thrilled to have another heart to love, another person who would surely appreciate everything I gave. I threw myself into motherhood with the intensity of someone trying to prove her worth. I volunteered at their schools, coached their little league teams, drove them to piano lessons and soccer practice and birthday parties. I sewed Halloween costumes by hand, baked elaborate birthday cakes, created magical Christmases on a tight budget through sheer force of will and creativity. When Linda was 8 and decided she wanted to be a ballerina, I worked extra hours to pay for lessons. When Robert showed an interest in chess, I learned the game myself so I could practice with him. When Tom decided we needed a bigger house, I took on a third part-time job to help with the down payment. I gave and gave and gave, powered by the belief that love was earned through service, that if I just did enough, sacrificed enough, proved my worth enough, I would finally receive the appreciation and affection I craved. That belief would nearly destroy me. The years blurred together in a haze of other people's needs. Linda's teenage years were marked by dramatic crises that somehow became my emergencies to solve. When she failed algebra, I hired a tutor I couldn't afford. When she wrecked Tom's car during her senior year, I worked overtime to pay for repairs without telling him the truth. When she got pregnant at 19 and decided to keep the baby, I rearranged my entire life to help raise my grandson while she finished college. "You're a lifesaver, Mom," she'd say when I showed up to babysit at a moment's notice. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I lived for those words. They were the only recognition I received for the constant stream of support I provided. Tom had long since stopped seeing my contributions as anything special. To him, I was like electricity or running water, essential but invisible until something went wrong. Robert followed a different path, but demanded the same level of service. He was academically gifted, which meant extra expenses for advanced programs, test prep, college applications. When he decided to pursue law school, I mortgaged the house to help pay his tuition. When he graduated and couldn't find a job immediately, I supported him for 6 months while he figured things out. "I'll pay you back, Mom," he promised. "Once I'm established, I'll take care of everything." The promises were always for later. Someday, when things settled down, when finances improved, when life got less complicated. But someday never came, and I stopped expecting it to. Tom developed heart problems in his 50s, which meant early retirement and a dramatic reduction in income. Suddenly, my part-time jobs became our primary support, but somehow this shift in financial responsibility didn't come with a shift in domestic duties. I worked 40 hours a week in a doctor's office, came home to cook dinner, clean the house, manage our medications, and listen to Tom's complaints about being useless. "You're amazing," visitors would tell him. "You're so lucky to have a wife who takes such good care of you." He'd nod and accept the praise as his due. I'd smile and refill the coffee cups, invisible in my own life. The children were grown and gone by then, but their needs seemed to expand to fill any available space in my schedule. Linda's marriage fell apart when her son was 12, and suddenly I was providing childcare again while she worked through her divorce. Robert moved across the country but called regularly with problems that required my immediate attention. A security deposit for a new apartment, money for car repairs, help dealing with difficult clients at his new firm. I said yes to everything. I solved every problem. I provided every solution. And with each crisis I handled, with each need I met, with each emergency I resolved, I disappeared a little more. The worst part wasn't the exhaustion, though I was bone-tired for decades. The worst part wasn't the financial strain, though I never had money for myself after everyone else's needs were met. The worst part was the growing realization that my value as a person was entirely tied to my usefulness to others. When Tom had his first heart attack at 62, I spent 3 days at the hospital, sleeping in a chair, advocating with doctors, coordinating with insurance companies, managing his care while juggling my work responsibilities and Linda's latest crisis. On the 4th day, when he was stable and recovering, I went home to shower and change clothes. I stood in my bathroom looking at myself in the mirror, and I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Gray hair I never had time to style properly, lines around my eyes from years of worry, clothes that fit poorly because I only shopped for others, a posture bent from carrying everyone else's burdens. Who was this person? What did she want? What made her happy? I honestly couldn't remember. Tom recovered from his heart attack and settled into a routine of careful invalidism. He followed doctor's orders when it came to diet and exercise, but he also used his condition as a reason to avoid any responsibility that might cause him stress. Paying bills stressed him. Dealing with repairmen stressed him. Making decisions about the house, the car, the insurance, everything stressed him. So I handled it all. I became the family CEO, managing everyone's finances, schedules, problems, and crises while maintaining the fiction that Tom was the head of the household. When people asked how he was doing, I'd update them on his health, his recovery, his needs. No one ever asked how I was doing. The grandchildren grew up seeing me as a resource rather than a person. I was the grandmother who always had time to babysit, money for emergencies, solutions for problems. They loved me the way you love a reliable appliance. You appreciate it when it works and notice it only when it breaks. Linda's second marriage brought new complications. Her husband, Paul, was nice enough, but he had 2 children from his first marriage and strong opinions about how money should be spent. Suddenly, my financial support for my grandson's college expenses became a source of marital tension. Linda asked me to contribute quietly, without Paul knowing, which meant secret bank transfers and coded conversations. "It's just easier this way," she explained. "You understand." I understood. I understood that I was being asked to provide support without recognition, help without appreciation, love without reciprocation. And I said yes, because I always said yes, because saying no felt like saying I didn't love them enough. Robert's career took off eventually, and he moved to Seattle with his wife and 2 daughters. He sent cards on holidays and called on my birthday, dutiful but distant. When he did call for help, it was usually financial. The down payment for a house, money for private school tuition, help with unexpected medical bills. I wire transferred thousands of dollars over the years, money I could have used for my own retirement, my own security, my own dreams. "I'll pay you back with interest," he always promised, but the money flowed in only one direction, like a river that never reverses course. Tom's health declined gradually but steadily. More medications, more doctor visits, more limitations. I became his full-time caregiver, while still working to support us both. My own health problems, the arthritis that made my hands ache, the back pain from lifting him, the chronic fatigue from years of poor sleep, were secondary concerns. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he'd say when I helped him dress or reminded him to take his pills. But I knew it wasn't gratitude I heard in his voice. It was possession. I wasn't a person he loved. I was a service he owned. The breaking point came slowly, then all at once, the way financial ruin or emotional collapse usually does. Tom died 4 years ago, quietly in his sleep after a final heart attack. I found him in the morning when I brought his coffee, and my first thought wasn't grief or loss. It was, now what? I'd spent 50 years defining myself through service to others. Without Tom to care for, who was I? The funeral was well attended. Tom had been liked and respected in the community. People told stories about his humor, his work ethic, his devotion to family. They praised me for being such a dedicated wife, for taking such good care of him, for sacrificing so much. But in the weeks after the service, as casseroles stopped arriving and sympathy cards dwindled, I discovered something devastating. The children I'd sacrificed everything for didn't actually need me anymore. They needed my money, my services, my solutions to their problems. But me, the person I was beneath all that giving, they barely knew her. Linda visited once a month, always with a purpose. Could I watch her son while she went on a business trip? Could I lend her money for a new car? Could I help her navigate her insurance claim after a minor fender bender? Our conversations were transactional, focused on what she needed rather than how I was coping with widowhood. Robert called every few weeks, dutiful check-ins that always seemed to end with requests. A loan to cover some unexpected expense. Advice on dealing with his wife's family drama. Help researching some financial or legal question. He was efficient with my time, conscious of long-distance rates, focused on getting information rather than providing comfort. Neither of them seemed to notice that I was drowning. Without Tom to care for, the apartment felt enormous and suffocatingly small at the same time. I had no hobbies, no friends, no interests beyond other people's needs. I'd been a wife and mother for so long that I'd forgotten how to be Margaret. I started walking in the mornings, partly for exercise, but mostly to have somewhere to go. The same route every day, past the same stores and corners, through the same neighborhoods where people hurried past without seeing me. I was 73 years old and utterly alone, financially comfortable, but emotionally bankrupt. That's when the text messages started arriving. Linda began sending brief updates about her life, the kind of messages you send to acquaintances rather than your mother. Got a promotion at work. Paul's dad is in the hospital. Jimmy made honor roll. No questions about how I was doing. No invitations to be part of these experiences. Just information, delivered efficiently and without warmth. Robert's communications became increasingly focused on money. His Seattle house needed a new roof. His oldest daughter wanted to attend an expensive summer program. His wife's medical bills from a minor surgery were higher than expected. Could I help? Could I contribute? Could I solve this problem? I said yes. I always said yes. I wire transferred money I couldn't really afford, depleting the savings that were supposed to support me through old age. Each transaction felt like buying love, purchasing relevance, paying for the privilege of being needed. But love can't be purchased. And I was learning that lesson one painful wire transfer at a time. The loneliness became a physical presence in my apartment, sitting with me at the kitchen table, accompanying me on my walks, lying beside me in bed. I started talking to myself just to hear a friendly voice. I left the television on all day for the illusion of company. I looked forward to interactions with grocery store clerks because they were the only people who spoke to me as if I mattered. Holidays were the worst. Linda's family celebrations had become complicated affairs involving Paul's children and ex-wife, schedules I couldn't follow and dynamics I didn't understand. I was invited, but as an afterthought, someone to fill a chair and bring a casserole. Robert's family was too far away to visit, so I spent Christmas alone with a frozen dinner and old movies, pretending I preferred the quiet. My 73rd birthday passed without acknowledgement from either of my children. Linda sent a card 3 days late with a generic message. Robert called a week later, apologizing for being busy. Neither of them asked how I'd spent the day or whether I'd been lonely. I had been. Devastatingly, completely lonely. That night, I sat at my kitchen table looking at the stack of bills I couldn't quite afford. Property taxes, insurance, medical expenses, the ongoing costs of maintaining a life I no longer wanted to live. I thought about calling Linda or Robert, asking for help, admitting that the woman who'd supported everyone else for 50 years needed support herself. But I knew what would happen. They'd be surprised, maybe alarmed, but not generous. They'd offer advice instead of assistance, suggestions instead of support. They'd remind me of my Social Security payments, my widow's benefits, the money I supposedly had but had actually spent on them. I was trapped in a cage I'd built myself, locked in by decades of giving without receiving, loving without being loved, mattering without being valued. The next morning, I found an eviction notice taped to Mrs. Peterson's door across the hall. She was 81, a widow like me, and apparently 3 months behind on rent. I knocked on her door and found her crying over a kitchen table covered with unpaid bills and medical statements. "I don't know what happened," she said through her tears. "I was managing okay, and then the prescriptions went up, and the heating bill was so high this winter, and my son keeps asking for help with his business." I sat with her for 2 hours that afternoon, helping her organize her papers and understand her situation. Her monthly income was enough to live on, barely, but she'd been sending money to her son in Denver for his failing restaurant. She'd refinanced her apartment to help him, borrowed against her future to fund his dreams. "But he's my son," she said when I gently suggested that maybe he needed to solve his own problems. "If I don't help him, who will?" I left her apartment feeling sick to my stomach. Mrs. Peterson was me, 5 years older and further down the same destructive path. She was being evicted because she'd loved her son more than she'd loved herself, and now she had nothing left to give. That night, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I thought about what I wanted, not what my children needed, not what Tom would have wanted, not what was expected of me. What I wanted. I wanted to travel. I wanted to see places I'd only read about in magazines, experience cultures different from my own, eat foods that weren't designed to please other people's tastes. I wanted friendships, real relationships with people who cared about my thoughts and feelings, not just my ability to solve their problems. I wanted to matter. Not as a source of money or free labor, but as a person with value beyond my usefulness to others. I wanted to say no, to set boundaries, to prioritize my own needs for once in my life. But wanting and doing are different things. And I'd spent 73 years training myself to ignore my own desires in favor of other people's demands. The text from Linda arrived the next morning while I was having coffee and reading the newspaper. Brief and efficient as always. "Can't make it today. Something came up. Maybe next week." She'd promised to visit, to spend Sunday afternoon with me, to let me cook dinner and pretend we were a family. Instead, I got 12 words and no explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that I might have been looking forward to seeing her. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it, more like recognition. The understanding that this pattern would continue until I died, that I would spend whatever years I had left waiting for crumbs of attention from people who saw me as a resource rather than a person, unless I changed it. I put on my coat and went for my walk, the same route I'd been taking for months, past the coffee shop with its tempting aromas, past the community center where senior programs were advertised on colorful flyers, past the bus stops where people waited to go places I'd never been. I was thinking about Mrs. Peterson, about eviction and loneliness, and the price of loving people who don't love you back. I was thinking about the money I'd wired to Robert last month, the emergency that wasn't really an emergency. I was thinking about Linda's casual cancellation and the Sunday I'd spend alone again. That's when I heard the footsteps behind me, rapid and urgent. Hide, wait. And everything changed. After the accident, after the police reports and the paramedic checks, after Marcus had gone on his way with my profound gratitude, I walked home with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The drunk driver who'd almost killed me had given me an unexpected gift: perspective. Life is short. Life is fragile. Life is precious. And I'd been wasting mine on people who didn't value it. I spent the rest of that Sunday afternoon doing something I'd never done before. I made a list of what I wanted from my remaining years. Not what others expected of me, not what I owed anyone, not what would keep the peace or maintain relationships. What I wanted. The list started small. A comfortable chair for reading, since I'd never owned furniture chosen for my own preferences. A passport, since I'd never traveled anywhere without Tom. A hobby that belonged to me alone. Friends who knew my name and cared about my opinions. But as I kept writing, the list grew more ambitious. Financial security that didn't depend on other people's approval. Boundaries that protected my time and energy. The courage to say no when yes would hurt me. The wisdom to distinguish between love and need, between family and exploitation. At the bottom of the page, I wrote, "A life that matters to me." That evening, I called Linda. She answered with her usual impatience, already annoyed before I'd said a word. "Mom, I told you I can't talk today. I'm busy." "I was almost killed this morning," I said quietly. I told her about the drunk driver, about Marcus, about how close I'd come to dying alone on a Chicago sidewalk. I listened to her response, waiting for something that would tell me I was wrong about our relationship, that she did love me beyond my usefulness to her. "Well, you're fine now, right? Look, Mom, I really do have to go. We'll talk later." The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone, feeling the last of my illusions crumble like old photographs. My daughter had just learned that I'd nearly died, and her response was irritation at being interrupted. I called Robert next. His reaction was slightly more concerned but equally self-centered. After expressing brief relief that I was okay, he launched into a story about his own near miss in Seattle traffic, making my experience about him. When I tried to talk about how the accident had made me think about mortality and priorities, he interrupted with a request. "Since I have you on the phone, Mom, I wanted to ask about helping Sarah with her college applications. The consultant fees are pretty steep, and I know you've always supported the kids' education." I hung up on my own son. I'd never hung up on either of my children before. I'd never cut short their requests, their stories, their demands on my time and attention, but something fundamental had shifted inside me, and I found I no longer had patience for being treated like a bank with feelings. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Marcus, a stranger who'd risked his own safety to save mine. He'd seen me as a person worth protecting, worth caring about, worth saving. When was the last time my own children had seen me that way? I got up and made tea, sitting at my kitchen table surrounded by the photographs that had defined my identity for decades. Wedding pictures where I looked young and hopeful. Baby pictures of children who'd grown into adults who barely tolerated me. Holiday celebrations where I'd worked myself to exhaustion to create memories for people who'd forgotten to include me in new ones. For the first time, I saw these photographs clearly. They weren't evidence of love. They were documentation of a lifetime of one-sided service. I made a decision that night that would change everything. I was going to stop earning love and start requiring it. The next morning, I called my bank and asked about my accounts, my investments, my financial situation. I'd been managing money for others for so long that I'd lost track of my own resources. What I discovered both relieved and horrified me. I had enough money to live comfortably if I stopped supporting adult children who were perfectly capable of supporting themselves. But I'd been on track to outlive my savings within 5 years if I continued the pattern of constant financial gifts and loans that were never repaid. I was literally giving away my future security to buy temporary relevance in my children's lives. The accountant I consulted was blunt. "Mrs. Anderson, you're being financially abused. I see this all the time with older clients. Adult children who treat their parents like ATM machines, who manipulate with guilt and promises they never intend to keep. Financially abused." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. I'd thought of myself as generous, loving, supportive, but generosity implies choice, and I'd never felt like I had a choice. Love shouldn't require constant proof, Support shouldn't flow in only one direction. I was being financially abused by my own children. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I went to a therapist. Dr. Sarah Kim was recommended by the community center, a warm woman in her 50s who specialized in family dynamics and life transitions. Her office was comfortable but not fancy, decorated with plants and soft lighting that made it easy to talk. "Tell me about your family," she said during our first session. I started with the usual script: how devoted my children were, how close we all were, how blessed I felt to be needed. But as I talked, the real story began to emerge. The constant financial requests, the casual cancellations, the way my children interacted with me only when they needed something. "When was the last time one of your children called just to see how you were doing?" Dr. Kim asked. "Not to ask for help or share news, but simply to connect with you as a person?" I sat there for several minutes, searching my memory. I couldn't remember a single instance in recent years. "What about your grandchildren? When did you last have a conversation with them about their interests, their dreams, their thoughts about the world?" Again, nothing. Every interaction was task-oriented. Homework help, transportation, financial support for activities I wasn't invited to attend. "Margaret," Dr. Kim said gently, "what you're describing isn't a family relationship. It's a service contract." I cried for 20 minutes in that office. 40 years of suppressed grief pouring out all at once. I cried for the young woman who'd thought marriage meant partnership. I cried for the mother who'd believed that sacrificial love would create deep bonds. I cried for the grandmother who'd tried to buy affection with college funds and emergency loans. Most of all, I cried for the person I'd lost somewhere along the way, the Margaret who'd had dreams and opinions and desires that mattered. "It's not too late," Dr. Kim said as I wiped my eyes. "You can still have the life you want, but it means making some difficult choices about the life you don't want anymore." Over the following weeks, I began to understand the psychology of my situation. I'd been trained from childhood to believe that women's value came from service to others. Marriage had reinforced this belief, and motherhood had made it seem noble and necessary. I'd organized my entire identity around being needed, which made it impossible to recognize when need became exploitation. The pattern was clear once I started looking for it. My children contacted me only when they had problems to solve or needs to meet. They shared good news efficiently, but bad news in detail, expecting me to provide emotional labor without reciprocation. They accepted my financial support as their due, but never offered to help with my expenses or concerns. I'd enabled this dynamic by never setting boundaries, never saying no, never requiring them to consider my needs alongside their own. In trying to be the perfect mother, I'd made myself into the perfect victim. But understanding the pattern and changing it were different challenges entirely. The first test came 2 weeks after I'd started therapy. Robert called with news that his roof repairs were going to cost more than expected. The contractor had found additional problems, and the estimate had doubled. Could I help with the difference? In the past, I would have transferred the money immediately, probably without asking detailed questions about the expense or his ability to handle it himself. This time I paused. "How are you planning to pay for the rest of it?" I asked. "Well, we have some savings, and the insurance will cover part of it, but it's still more than we budgeted for, and Sarah's tuition is due next month." "So you're asking me to pay for your roof so you can pay for Sarah's tuition?" When you put it like that, it sounds bad. But Mom, you know we'd do the same for you. Would they? When had they ever offered to help me with an unexpected expense? When had they even asked if I had unexpected expenses? "I need to think about it," I said. There was silence on the other end of the line. In our family, "I need to think about it" had never been part of the vocabulary. Financial requests were emergencies that required immediate solutions, and I was always the solution. "Think about it? Mom, this is urgent. The contractor needs an answer by Friday." "Then you'd better start thinking of other options," I said, and hung up. My hands were shaking as I set down the phone. I'd never said no to either of my children before, never made them solve their own problems, never prioritized my own financial security over their convenience. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. Robert called back an hour later, his tone carefully controlled but clearly frustrated. "I'm sorry if I pushed too hard," he said, though he didn't sound sorry. "I just thought, since you've always been there for us, always been there for them." Yes, I had been. But where had they been for me? "Robert, I love you very much, but I'm not going to pay for your roof. You're a successful lawyer with a good income. This is your responsibility to handle." "Fine," he said coldly. "I guess I'll figure something else out." He hung up without saying goodbye, and I knew I was being punished for the crime of setting a boundary. Linda's test came a week later. She needed me to watch her son for a weekend while she and Paul went to a wedding in Milwaukee. The old Margaret would have said yes immediately, would have been grateful to be needed, would have cleared her entire schedule to accommodate their plans. The new Margaret had made plans of her own. I can't, I told her. I'm going to a pottery class that weekend. A pottery class? Mom, this is important. We already RSVP'd yes to the wedding. Then you'll need to find another babysitter. But Jimmy loves staying with you, and it's so much easier than finding someone else. Easier for whom? Not for me, certainly. Not for the 73-year-old woman who'd been providing free childcare for decades while her own needs went unmet. I'm sure Jimmy will be fine with a babysitter. There are several good services in your neighborhood. Those cost money, Mom. And there it was. The real issue. Not that Jimmy loved staying with me. Not that we had a special relationship. But that I was free and professional childcare cost money. I'm not available, I said firmly. You'll need to make other arrangements. Linda was quiet for a moment. Then her voice turned sharp. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this selfishness isn't attractive. Selfishness. The word that had controlled me for decades. The accusation I'd feared more than death itself. But this time, instead of rushing to apologize and accommodate, I felt a calm certainty. Taking care of myself isn't selfish, Linda. It's necessary. I hung up feeling stronger than I had in years. The pottery class was wonderful. I'd found it through the community center, a beginner's workshop held on Saturday mornings in a bright studio in Pilsen. The instructor was a patient woman named Carmen, and my classmates were a diverse group of people looking to learn something new or rediscover old passions. Nobody there knew me as anyone's mother or wife. They knew me as Margaret, the woman who was surprisingly good at centering clay on the wheel and had interesting stories about growing up in Chicago. For 3 hours every Saturday morning, I was just myself, focused on creating something beautiful with my own hands. The feeling of wet clay responding to my touch was unlike anything I'd experienced. It required presence, attention, patience, qualities I'd always given freely to others but never to myself. When I messed up, which happened often, I could simply start over. The clay didn't judge me or find me insufficient. It just waited for me to try again. After the third class, I stayed behind to help Carmen clean up. We talked about art and life while washing tools and covering unfinished pieces. She was an immigrant from Mexico who'd built a life in Chicago through small acts of courage and determination. I see many people come through here, she told me. Some are running from something, some are running to something. You look like someone who's finally running to something good. Running to something good. I liked that description better than running away from something bad, though both were true. Over the following months, I built a new routine around my own interests rather than other people's needs. Tuesday evenings, I volunteered at the library, helping older adults learn to use computers. Thursday afternoons, I attended a book club at the community center. Saturdays were for pottery. Sundays I reserved for myself, reading, walking, visiting museums, or simply enjoying the luxury of an unscheduled day. My children's reactions to these changes ranged from confusion to irritation to something approaching panic. Linda complained that I was never available when she needed me. Robert seemed baffled by my newfound unwillingness to solve his problems with immediate financial help. You're different, Linda said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. It's like you don't care about family anymore. But I did care about family. I just no longer believed that caring meant disappearing into other people's needs. I'd started requiring family to be reciprocal, to involve mutual care and consideration rather than one-sided service. The change wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt when the old guilt would resurface, when I'd wonder if I was being selfish or unreasonable. The therapist helped me work through these feelings, helping me understand the difference between healthy boundaries and selfish behavior. Selfish people take without giving, Dr. Kim explained. You've given for 50 years without taking. Setting boundaries now isn't selfish. It's survival. The financial boundaries were particularly difficult to maintain. Both children continued to ask for money, though less frequently and with more elaborate justifications. Each time I said no, I felt the weight of decades of conditioning that told me good mothers always said yes. But I also felt the growing strength of a woman who was finally learning to value herself. The holiday season was especially challenging. Linda's family celebrations had grown even more complicated, involving stepchildren and ex-spouses and scheduling conflicts that somehow never quite accommodated my preferences or limitations. When I suggested that maybe we could have a simple dinner at my apartment, just the immediate family, Linda looked at me as if I'd proposed something completely unreasonable. Mom, you know how Paul's kids feel about coming to your place? It's so small and there's nothing for them to do. Nothing for them to do. No video games or pool table or elaborate entertainment. Just conversation with their step-grandmother, which apparently wasn't engaging enough to warrant their time. Then maybe they could stay home this year, I suggested. We could have a quiet celebration with just family. They are family, Linda said sharply. Paul's kids are part of our family now, but I wasn't part of theirs. That much was clear from every interaction, every plan made around my absence, every conversation that stopped when I entered the room. I spent Christmas alone that year by choice, not circumstance. I made myself a beautiful meal, watched old movies, and called Mrs. Peterson to make sure she wasn't spending the holiday in loneliness. She'd managed to avoid eviction by finally cutting off financial support to her son, and she was learning, like me, to distinguish between love and enabling. Robert called on Christmas evening, his voice carefully cheerful but slightly strained. "Sorry we couldn't connect earlier. It's been a crazy day with the kids and Julia's family. How was your day?" "Peaceful," I said. "I enjoyed the quiet. You should have called if you were lonely. We would have made time to talk." But I hadn't been lonely. I'd been alone, which was different. Loneliness is wanting connection and not having it. Being alone is choosing solitude and finding peace in it. For the first time in decades, I'd spent Christmas exactly as I wanted, quietly, peacefully, without stress or obligation, or the exhausting effort of trying to connect with people who barely saw me. The new year brought new challenges and new growth. I'd been in therapy for 6 months, attending pottery classes for 4 months, and maintaining financial boundaries for 3 months. The changes in my life were becoming visible to others, though not everyone appreciated them. Linda's friend Joyce, whom I'd known for years, stopped me after church one Sunday with a concerned expression. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, Margaret, but Linda is worried about you. She says you've been distant lately, not as involved with the family. Not as involved with the family. Another way of saying not as available for exploitation, not as willing to provide free services, not as eager to solve problems that weren't mine to solve. I've been focusing on my own life more," I told Joyce. "It's been good for me. But family should come first," she said, with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned conventional wisdom, especially at your age. "What else do you have if not family?" What else did I have? I had pottery classes where I created beautiful things with my own hands. I had volunteer work that gave me purpose and connection. I had books that transported me to other worlds and ideas that challenged my assumptions. I had the freedom to make decisions based on my own preferences rather than other people's expectations. I had myself, finally, after years of losing her in service to others. "I have a life," I told Joyce, "and I'm finally learning to live it." But the real test of my transformation was still to come. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March while I was reading in my comfortable new armchair, the one I'd bought for myself without asking anyone's opinion about the color or style. Linda's voice was tight with stress and something else. Desperation, maybe, or fear. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to really consider it before you say no." The preamble was new. In the past, Linda's requests had been presented as emergencies requiring immediate action. This careful introduction suggested she knew I'd changed, but she was hoping to manipulate the old Margaret back into compliance. "Paul's been let go from his job," she continued. "The company is downsizing, and he was one of the last hired. We're going to be okay, but money will be tight for a while, and we might lose the house if we can't make the mortgage payments." She paused, waiting for me to offer a solution, to leap in with financial rescue as I'd done hundreds of times before. When I remained silent, she continued, "I know you've been different lately, and I respect that you want to focus on yourself. But this is serious, Mom. We could lose everything. Everything. Their house, their lifestyle, their sense of security. But not everything," I noticed. "Just the things that money could buy. Not the relationships that should sustain them through difficult times." "What's Paul's plan for finding new work?" I asked. "He's applying everywhere, of course. But you know how the job market is. It could take months. What about your income? Can you increase your hours or find additional work?" "I'm already working full-time, and with Paul's kids every other weekend, I don't have time for a second job." Every answer was a reason why they couldn't solve their own problems, why they needed me to solve these problems for them. It was a familiar pattern, and I was being invited to play my familiar role. "How much do you need?" I heard relief in her voice when she answered. "If you could cover the mortgage for 3 or 4 months, just until Paul finds something, we'd pay you back as soon as we're stable. $2,400 a month for 4 months. Nearly $10,000 to prevent consequences that were ultimately not my responsibility. Money I could use for travel, for home improvements, for my own security in old age. I'm not going to do that," I said quietly. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had been dropped. "What do you mean?" Linda finally asked. "I mean, I'm not going to pay your mortgage. This is something you and Paul need to figure out yourselves. But we could lose the house. That would be unfortunate. But it wouldn't be my fault or my responsibility." "I can't believe you're being so selfish." The veneer of politeness dropped completely. This is your daughter asking for help, and you're worried about money you don't even need. Money I don't even need. As if my financial security was irrelevant. As if I existed only to provide for others' comfort and convenience. Linda, you're 47 years old. Paul is 52. You're both capable adults with job skills and life experience. This is your crisis to manage. Fine. Her voice was sharp with anger and something that might have been panic. Don't help. But don't expect me to pretend everything is fine between us when you won't be there for your own family. The threat was clear. Help us financially or lose access to your daughter and grandson. It was emotional blackmail, pure and simple. And for the first time in my life, I recognized it as such. I hope you and Paul find a solution that works for your family, I said. But it won't involve my money. I hung up feeling shaky but determined. This was the moment I'd been preparing for without knowing it. The test that would determine whether my transformation was real or just temporary rebellion. Linda didn't call for 2 weeks. When she finally did, her voice was strained but carefully controlled. I wanted you to know that Paul found a new job. It doesn't pay as much as the old one, but it's something. I'm glad to hear that. We're going to have to sell the house anyway. Downsize to something more affordable. She was waiting for me to offer help, to provide the financial cushion that would let them keep their current lifestyle. When I didn't respond, she continued. Jimmy is really upset about changing schools. He's been looking forward to playing on the high school baseball team, playing on my emotions through my grandson, appealing to my love for him and my guilt about disrupting his life. Another familiar pattern. But I was no longer the same person who'd fallen for it countless times before. Change is hard, I said, but Jimmy is resilient. He'll make friends at his new school. I just can't believe you're okay with this. Your grandson having to leave his friends, start over somewhere new, all because you wouldn't help when we needed it. Because I wouldn't help. As if their financial problems were my fault. As if my refusal to enable poor decision-making had created their crisis. Linda, your housing situation is not my responsibility. Jimmy's education is not my responsibility. Your family's financial management is not my responsibility. Then what is your responsibility? What do you think family means? It was a fair question, and I'd been thinking about it for months. What did family mean when it was no longer organized around my service to others? Family means caring about each other's well-being, not just each other's problems. It means supporting each other emotionally, not just financially. It means spending time together because we enjoy each other's company, not just when you need something from me. We do care about your well-being. When was the last time you asked how I was doing and waited for a real answer? When did you last visit without needing something? When have you ever offered to help me with anything? The questions hung in the air between us, unanswerable because the answer was never. After that conversation, our relationship entered a new phase. Linda still called occasionally, but the calls were brief and awkward. She'd share basic information about their move, about Jimmy's adjustment to his new school, about Paul's new job. But the warmth was gone. I was being punished for setting boundaries, for refusing to continue in my role as family ATM. Robert's reaction was different but equally telling. When Linda told him about my refusal to help with their mortgage, he called me with what he probably thought was a reasonable compromise. Mom, I know you're trying to encourage Linda to be more independent, and I respect that. But maybe you could help them with a smaller amount? Not the whole mortgage, just enough to make the transition easier? Still looking for ways to extract money from me, just in smaller amounts that might seem more reasonable. Still operating from the assumption that my resources existed primarily for their benefit. No, I said simply. No, you won't consider it? Or no, you need more information about their situation? No, I won't give them money. And no, I won't give you money the next time you have a financial crisis either. The silence that followed was profound. Robert was calculating, I realized, trying to understand how this change in our relationship might affect his own financial security. I don't understand where this is coming from, he said finally. We've always been there for each other as a family, always been there for each other. Another lie we'd all agreed to believe, despite clear evidence to the contrary. When had either of my children ever been there for me in any meaningful way? Robert, I've been there for you and Linda for 50 years. You've been there for my money, my problem-solving abilities, and my willingness to drop everything when you needed help. But you haven't been there for me as a person. That's not fair, Mom. We love you. You love what I do for you. You love how I make your lives easier. But do you love me? Do you actually know me well enough to love me? It was a harsh question, but it was the root of everything that had gone wrong between us. They loved the services I provided, but they barely knew the person providing them. The conversation ended awkwardly, and I knew that my relationship with Robert had also fundamentally changed. I was no longer the source of unconditional support he'd taken for granted. I was a person with boundaries, preferences, and the radical expectation of reciprocal care in our relationship. The isolation that followed was difficult, but not devastating. I'd expected my children to react poorly to my transformation, and I'd built supports to help me weather their withdrawal. Therapy continued to provide insight and encouragement. My pottery classes had evolved into genuine friendships with people who appreciated my company rather than my usefulness. The volunteer work at the library connected me with a community of people working to improve their own lives. I wasn't lonely anymore, even when I was alone. The epiphany came 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in September. I was walking to my pottery class, taking a slightly different route through the neighborhood, when I passed a small park where families were gathering for some kind of celebration. Children ran around with balloons while adults set up tables and unpacked food. I paused to watch, not out of longing, but out of simple interest in the warm chaos of human connection. That's when I heard someone call my name. "Mrs. Anderson! Mrs. Anderson!" I turned to see Marcus, the runner who'd saved my life, jogging toward me with a wide smile. He was wearing civilian clothes instead of running gear, and he looked younger, more relaxed. "I was hoping I'd run into you again," he said, slightly out of breath. "I've thought about you so many times since that morning. How are you doing?" How was I doing? It was such a simple question, but it had been months since anyone had asked it and waited for a real answer. "I'm doing well," I said, and realized it was true. "Really well, actually. Thank you for asking." "I'm so glad to hear that. You look different. Happier, maybe? More present. More present." Yes, that was exactly right. I was finally present in my own life instead of being a supporting character in everyone else's story. We talked for a few minutes about ordinary things: the neighborhood, the weather, the community programs we were both involved in. It was the kind of casual, friendly conversation I'd been starving for without realizing it. Connection based on genuine interest rather than obligation or need. "Are you heading somewhere?" he asked, noticing the bag I was carrying. "Pottery class," I said, and heard the pride in my own voice. "I started taking lessons a few months ago." "That's wonderful. I've always wanted to try something creative like that. Is it hard to learn?" "It's challenging, but that's part of what makes it satisfying. There's something about working with clay that's very honest. It responds to how you treat it." He smiled at that. "Sounds like good life advice, too." After he left, continuing his jog through the neighborhood, I stood there for a moment, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: simple happiness. Not the frantic satisfaction of solving someone else's problems or meeting someone else's needs, but the quiet contentment of being seen and appreciated as myself. The pottery class that day was particularly good. I was working on a series of bowls, each one slightly different as I learned to control the clay and trust my own aesthetic instincts. Carmen complimented the glaze I'd chosen for the previous week's work, a deep blue that reminded me of Lake Michigan on calm days. "You're developing your own style," she said. "That's when you know someone is becoming a real potter, when they stop trying to copy other people's work and start expressing their own vision." My own vision. I liked the sound of that. After class, a few of us went to lunch at a nearby cafe, something that had become a regular tradition. The conversation ranged from art to politics to personal stories, and I found myself participating fully, offering opinions and sharing experiences without worrying about whether I was being too much or not enough. These women, Carmen, Susan, Patricia, and Diane, knew me as someone worth listening to. They asked follow-up questions when I told stories. They remembered details from previous conversations. They invited me to bring my perspective to their discussions. It was such a simple thing, being treated as if my thoughts and feelings mattered. But it had been so absent from my family relationships that it felt revolutionary. That evening, I was sitting on my small balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and pink when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Linda's number, and I felt the old familiar tightness in my chest before I remembered. I was different now. I had choices. I could answer or not answer. I could set the terms of the conversation. I could hang up if the call became harmful to my well-being. I had power in this relationship now. Power I'd given away so completely that reclaiming it felt strange and wonderful. "Hello, Linda?" "Hi, Mom." Her voice was softer than it had been in our recent conversations, less demanding and more tentative. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The question surprised me. Linda had never worried about interrupting me before, had never seemed to consider that I might have my own agenda or priorities. "I was just enjoying the evening," I said. "What's on your mind?" "I wanted to let you know that we're settled in the new place. It's smaller than the old house, but it's nice. Jimmy likes his new school more than he expected to. Information sharing without requests for help or sympathy. This was new. I'm glad the transition went smoothly. It wasn't easy, but..." Well, Paul and I had to learn to handle things ourselves. We'd gotten used to calling you whenever something went wrong, and maybe that wasn't fair to you. Maybe that wasn't fair to me. It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of our dysfunctional pattern that I'd ever heard from her. "How are you doing?" she asked before I could respond to her previous comment. I mean, really doing. Not just the automatic fine. How was I really doing? The question was so unexpected from Linda that it took me a moment to process it. "I'm doing better than I have in years," I said honestly. "I've been taking pottery classes, volunteering at the library, generally learning to enjoy my own company." "Pottery classes? I didn't know you were interested in art." "I didn't either. It turns out there are a lot of things about myself I didn't know." There was a pause. And when Linda spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you said, about family meaning more than just helping with problems. And I realized I don't really know what you like to do for fun. I don't know what your favorite books are or what kind of music you listen to or what you think about when you're alone." It was a startling admission, though not a surprising one. Linda was recognizing what I'd understood months earlier. Our relationship had been built around my usefulness rather than genuine connection. "Would you like to know those things?" I asked. "Yes," she said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I would. And maybe you could teach me about pottery sometime. I mean, if you want to share that with me." The offer was tentative, clearly outside Linda's comfort zone, but it represented something genuinely new in our relationship. She was asking to participate in my life rather than demanding that I solve problems in hers. "I'd like that," I said. "The studio offers mother-daughter workshops once a month." "Really? That sounds nice. Different, but nice." We talked for another 20 minutes, and it was unlike any conversation we'd had in years. Linda asked questions about my volunteer work, my pottery, my thoughts about living alone in the city. I found myself sharing things I hadn't told anyone. How much I enjoyed the quiet independence of my current life, how pottery had taught me patience with myself, how I was considering taking a trip to New Mexico to visit some famous ceramic studios. "New Mexico?" Linda sounded surprised. "By yourself?" "By myself," I confirmed. "I've never traveled alone before, and it seems like something I should experience." "Aren't you nervous about that?" I considered the question. A year ago, the idea of solo travel would have terrified me. Now it felt like an adventure, an opportunity to discover what I enjoyed when I didn't have to consider anyone else's preferences or limitations. A little nervous, but mostly excited. I think I'll enjoy making my own decisions about where to go and what to see. "That's actually pretty brave, Mom." Brave. When was the last time anyone had called me brave? I'd been dutiful, helpful, sacrificial, accommodating, but never brave. Bravery required risking something for the chance of something better, and I'd spent decades avoiding risk in favor of maintaining the status quo. But I was being brave now, finally. Brave enough to say no. Brave enough to set boundaries. Brave enough to prioritize my own happiness. Brave enough to risk losing relationships that weren't serving me in pursuit of relationships that might. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony for a long time, watching the city lights flicker on as darkness settled over Chicago. The conversation with Linda offered hope for something better between us, but it also reminded me how far we'd have to travel to build a genuine relationship. The important thing was that we were both willing to make the journey. Robert called the following week, ostensibly to check on me, but really to gauge whether my new boundaries were permanent or just a temporary phase he needed to wait out. The conversation was cordial but careful, both of us testing the new dynamic between us. "Linda mentioned that you're taking pottery classes," he said. "That's unexpected." "Why unexpected?" "I just never thought of you as the artistic type, I guess." Never thought of me as the artistic type. Because he'd never thought of me as having any type beyond mother and problem solver. I was a collection of functions in his mind, not a person with interests and talents and dreams. "There are probably a lot of things about me you don't know," I said mildly. "Yeah, maybe. Maybe we should talk more. Like, really talk, not just the logistic stuff." It was a small opening, but an opening nonetheless. Robert was beginning to understand that if he wanted a relationship with his mother, he needed to know who his mother actually was. The changes in my children's attitudes toward me were gradual and sometimes inconsistent, but they were real. They were learning to see me as a person rather than a resource, and I was learning to require that recognition as the foundation of any relationship. But the most important change was in how I saw myself. 9 months after the morning when Marcus saved my life, I was packing for my trip to New Mexico, carefully folding clothes into a suitcase I'd bought specifically for solo travel. The suitcase was small but well made, designed for someone who prioritized experiences over possessions, adventure over comfort. Looking at my packed bags, I felt a thrill of anticipation unlike anything I'd experienced in decades. This trip belonged entirely to me. I'd chosen the destination based on my own interests, planned the itinerary around my own preferences, budgeted for experiences that excited me personally. For 5 days, I would be accountable to no one but myself. I would eat when I was hungry, sleep when I was tired, explore what interested me, and skip what didn't. I would have conversations with strangers, or sit in comfortable silence, or do whatever felt right in the moment. I would remember what it felt like to exist as Margaret, not as someone's mother or wife or problem solver, but as a woman with her own curiosity and courage and capacity for joy. The morning I left for the airport, my phone rang. It was Linda, calling to wish me a safe trip. "Are you excited?" she asked. "Terrified and excited," I admitted, but more excited than terrified. "I'm proud of you, Mom. This whole transformation you've been going through. It's been hard to adjust to, but I think it's been good for you. Proud of me." When was the last time one of my children had said those words? When was the last time I'd done something that warranted pride rather than just gratitude? "Thank you," I said. "That means more than you know. Call me when you get there. I want to hear about your adventures." She wanted to hear about my adventures. Not my problems or my services or my solutions to her crises, but my adventures. The shift was subtle but profound. The flight to Albuquerque was my first solo air travel in 40 years, and I spent the 3 hours reading a book about Southwestern pottery traditions, occasionally looking out the window at landscapes I'd never seen before. The woman next to me was also traveling alone, a retired teacher from Minneapolis who was visiting her daughter. "First solo trip?" she asked, noticing how often I checked my boarding pass and travel documents. "Is it that obvious?" She laughed. I remember my first trip alone after my husband died. I was so nervous I packed 3 different backup outfits for every day, but it was the best thing I ever did for myself. We talked for the rest of the flight about the liberation of solo travel, the joy of making decisions based entirely on your own preferences, the confidence that comes from navigating new places independently. By the time we landed, I felt less like an anxious beginner and more like an adventurous woman embarking on a well-deserved journey. The 5 days in New Mexico exceeded every expectation. I visited pottery studios in small towns whose names I could barely pronounce, watched master ceramicists at work, learned about techniques and traditions that stretched back hundreds of years. I bought pieces that spoke to me without worrying about where I'd display them or whether anyone else would appreciate them. I hiked canyon trails at my own pace, stopping to photograph wildflowers and rock formations that caught my eye. I ate in restaurants I chose randomly, sometimes talking with other diners, sometimes eating in peaceful solitude while watching sunsets that painted the desert in impossible colors. On my last evening, I sat in the courtyard of my small hotel in Santa Fe, working in the travel journal I'd started keeping. I was documenting not just the places I'd been and things I'd seen, but my thoughts and feelings throughout the experience. "I feel like I'm remembering how to be myself," I wrote. "For so many years, I existed in relationship to other people's needs and wants. I was Tom's wife, Linda and Robert's mother, Jimmy's grandmother. I was the person who solved problems and provided support and never asked for anything in return. I forgot that I was also Margaret, a woman with her own interests, opinions, dreams, and desires. The recognition felt like coming home to myself after decades of living in exile. The flight back to Chicago was different from the journey out. I was returning not as the same person who'd left, but as someone who'd expanded, who'd proven to herself that she could navigate the world independently and find joy in her own company. Linda met me at the airport, something she'd volunteered to do rather than something I'd asked for. She hugged me with genuine warmth and asked immediately about the trip, listening with real interest as I shared highlights from my adventure. "You look different," she said as we drove through the city toward my apartment. "Happier, more yourself, somehow. More myself." Yes, that was exactly right. Over dinner that night, Linda had suggested a restaurant I'd mentioned wanting to try. Another small but significant gesture. She asked me about the pottery I'd seen, the techniques I'd learned, the landscapes I'd explored. For the first time in our adult relationship, she seemed genuinely curious about my experiences and perspectives. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me over dessert, "about me not really knowing you as a person. And you were right. I knew you as my mother, but not as Margaret. I want to change that, if you're willing." If I was willing? She was asking for my consent to develop a deeper relationship, acknowledging my agency in a way she never had before. "I'm willing," I said, "but it means things will continue to be different between us. I won't go back to being available for everything, solving every problem, saying yes to every request. I know, And honestly, I think that's better. For both of us. I need to learn to handle my own life, and you need to live yours. It was the most mature conversation we'd ever had, and the foundation for whatever our relationship would become going forward. Robert's response to my transformation was slower and more cautious, but equally real. He started calling more regularly, not with requests or crises, but with what he called check-ins, brief conversations about our respective lives that felt more like friendship than obligation. I've been thinking about visiting Chicago this summer, he mentioned during one of these calls. Not for any specific reason, just to see you and spend some time in the city, just to see me. Not for a favor or a family obligation, but because he wanted to spend time with his mother as a person worth visiting. I'd like that, I said. There are some pottery studios I could show you, and the lake is beautiful in summer. Pottery studios? I had no idea you were so serious about this hobby. It's more than a hobby now. It's become a passion. I'd love to see your work. The conversation felt natural and warm, the kind of interaction I'd always hoped to have with my children, but had never known how to create. It turned out the secret wasn't in what I gave them, but in who I chose to be when I was with them. A year after Marcus saved my life on that Chicago sidewalk, I was a completely different person, living a completely different life. Not different in dramatic, external ways. I still lived in the same apartment, still had the same children and grandchildren, still faced the ordinary challenges of being a woman in her 70s in a big city, but different in every way that mattered. I no longer defined myself through other people's needs or measured my worth by my usefulness to others. I had interests, friendships, plans, and dreams that belonged entirely to me. I said no when saying yes would harm me, and I said yes only when it genuinely served both my interests and the interests of others. I'd learned to distinguish between love and need, between family and exploitation, between generosity and enabling. Most importantly, I'd learned that taking care of myself wasn't selfish. It was essential. The photography project started almost by accident. During one of my regular walks through the neighborhood, I began noticing things I'd overlooked for years. The way morning light hit the brick buildings, the flowers growing in unexpected places, the faces of people lost in their own thoughts. I bought a simple digital camera and started documenting these moments, not for any particular purpose, but simply because they interested me. The pictures weren't technically perfect, but they captured something real about urban life, about the beauty that exists in ordinary moments when you're present enough to notice it. Carmen, my pottery instructor, saw some of the photos when I showed them to the class and suggested I submit them to a local gallery that featured work by senior artists. The idea terrified me. Putting my creative work into the world for strangers to judge felt impossibly vulnerable. But I'd been practicing courage for over a year, and I was getting better at it. The gallery accepted 3 of my photographs for their autumn show. They were small pieces in a group exhibition, but seeing my work hanging on professional walls with my name beside it felt like the culmination of a journey I hadn't even known I was taking. Linda came to the opening reception, genuinely excited about my accomplishment and proud to introduce me to her friends as my mother, the artist. The words felt strange and wonderful. Mother, yes, but also artist. Mother, but not only mother. Robert flew in from Seattle specifically for the event, bringing his wife and daughters to meet their grandmother, the photographer. His girls, now teenagers, seemed genuinely impressed that their grandma had work in a real gallery. "This is so cool, Grandma," his younger daughter said, studying one of my prints carefully. "I didn't know you were creative." "I didn't know either," I told her. "I'm still discovering what I'm capable of." The family celebration after the gallery opening was unlike any we'd ever had. Instead of being organized around my service to others, it was organized around recognition of my achievements. People asked me questions about my artistic process, my plans for future work, my experiences learning new skills in my 70s. For the first time in decades, I was the center of attention for something I'd accomplished rather than something I'd provided. But the moment that mattered most came later that evening, when Linda and I were alone in my apartment, looking through the portfolio of photographs I hadn't submitted to the gallery. "These are beautiful, Mom," she said, pausing at a picture of an elderly man feeding pigeons in a small park. "You really see people. You see their dignity, their humanity." "I think I learned to see my own dignity first," I said. "Once you recognize your own worth, it's easier to recognize it in others." She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been respect mixed with recognition, as if she was seeing me clearly for the first time. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see yours," she said quietly. The apology was unexpected and deeply healing, not because I needed her validation to feel worthy, but because it acknowledged the pain we'd both experienced during our years of dysfunction and the work we'd both done to create something better. As winter settled over Chicago again, I found myself in the strange position of having more social invitations than I could accept. The pottery group had become a circle of genuine friends who celebrated each other's work and supported each other through life's challenges. The photography class I joined introduced me to people who shared my growing passion for visual storytelling. The volunteer work at the library connected me with a community of learners and teachers who valued knowledge and curiosity. I had to start saying no to social invitations, not because I was being used, but because I was genuinely popular, because people enjoyed my company and sought out my perspectives on art, life, and the experience of aging with purpose and passion. It was a good problem to have. The morning walks that had once been an exercise in loneliness had become opportunities for pleasant encounters with neighbors who knew my name and asked about my latest projects. Marcus and I had become casual friends, often chatting when our routes crossed, and he'd introduced me to other runners and walkers who made the neighborhood feel like a community rather than just a collection of strangers. "You saved my life," I told him one morning when we met at our usual corner. "I saved you from a drunk driver," he corrected with a smile. "You saved your own life." He was right. The physical danger had passed in minutes, but the real threat, the slow suffocation of a life lived entirely for others, had taken a year to fully escape. And that escape had required choices I'd made myself, boundaries I'd set myself, courage I'd found within myself. The elderly woman who'd stood on that sidewalk 14 months ago, waiting for a phone call that would never come, and dreading another day of invisible loneliness, was gone. In her place was someone I was still getting to know. An artist, a friend, a traveler, a woman with opinions and preferences and the radical expectation that her own life should matter to her. Looking back now, I understand that the drunk driver was never the real danger. The real danger was the life I'd been living, the gradual disappearance of myself into other people's needs and expectations. Marcus saved me from 3 seconds of physical peril, but the transformation that followed saved me from decades of spiritual death. I think about that morning often. How a stranger's moment of caring created space for me to begin caring about myself. How 2 words, hide, wait, became the beginning of a complete reconstruction of my understanding of love, family, and self-worth. I'm 74 now, and I measure my age not in years, but in experiences I'm still having for the first time. First solo trip, first art exhibition, first time setting boundaries with my children, first time choosing myself without apology. Linda and I have our mother-daughter pottery workshop scheduled for next month. Robert is planning his summer visit, and we've talked about visiting some of the photography locations I've discovered in different neighborhoods around the city. Jimmy, now in high school, has started calling me regularly. Not because he needs anything, but because he's genuinely curious about his grandmother's unexpectedly interesting life. The relationships aren't perfect, but they're real in ways they never were before. They're based on mutual interest and genuine affection rather than unbalanced exchanges of service and need. My children know me now as a person, not just as the woman who solved their problems, and they like the person they've discovered. Most importantly, I like the person I've discovered too. Tomorrow morning, I'll take my usual walk through the neighborhood, camera in hand, looking for moments of beauty and dignity in the ordinary lives around me. I might stop for coffee with Patricia from pottery class, or visit Mrs. Peterson to see how her garden is growing, or spend the afternoon reading in the park where families gather and children play. Whatever I do, I'll do it because it brings me joy, because it serves my own growth and interests, because it contributes to the life I'm actively choosing rather than the life that's simply happening to me. This is what I want you to remember from my story. It's never too late to save your own life. It's never too late to remember who you are beneath all the roles you've played for others. It's never too late to require the people who claim to love you to actually know you and treat you with dignity. You don't have to wait for someone else to value you. You can start by valuing yourself. You don't have to earn love through service. You can offer love through authenticity and require the same in return. The voice that tells you to hide your needs, sacrifice your dreams, and disappear into other people's lives, that voice is lying to you. The world needs you to be fully yourself, completely present, courageously authentic. Your life matters. Your dreams matter. Your peace of mind and happiness and sense of purpose matter. And if you've been living like they don't, if you've been slowly disappearing into other people's expectations and demands, then maybe it's time for you to hear what Marcus told me that morning. Hide. Wait. Hide from the voices that tell you you're selfish for having needs. Wait through the guilt and fear that come with setting boundaries. Because on the other side of that hiding and waiting, there's a life worth living. There's you, worth knowing and loving and protecting. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, slowly disappearing into other people's needs while forgetting your own worth? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our experiences is the first step toward changing them. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe. It helps me continue sharing these messages with people who need to hear them. Together, we can remind each other that it's never too late to start living the life we actually want.